Random thoughts. In this video, I'm going to read part of Douglas Jardine's book, The Mad Mullah. Now, The Mad Mullah is a book that was published in early 1920s. It's a sort of biography of Mohammed Abdullah Hassan. Now, Mohammed Abdullah Hassan is a person who launched and carried out a war on the British beginning 1899 to early 1920s. It's a war that went on for a very long time. It was called the Dervish Wars. And Jardine decided to write this book about him and describing who he was and the activities he was involved in. Now, in this part, he's still giving us the backdrop. He's telling us about the history, the culture, the geography. He's giving us all this information he believed that we needed to have for us to understand the story of Mohammed Abdullah Hassan. Now, in this part, I'm going to read is about the position of women in the Somali community. Especially in Somaliland in 1920s. And I found this part to be very interesting for a reason that very recently I read CW Hobley's book, The Bantu Beliefs and Magic. And in this book, Hobley, which is a book that was also published in 1920s, he discusses the political organization, the culture, and things like that about the Kikuyu and the Akamba people of Kenya. And in some part of that book, he talks about the position of women in the Kikuyu society, or the Kikuyu Republic, as I prefer calling it. And what becomes very interesting in the way he describes this position of women in the Kikuyu society is that when an outsider came in, the first impression they will have is that the Kikuyu women had no say, had no power. They just were there to be seen, and the men ran the show. But then when you stayed there a little bit longer, then you came to realize that actually the Kikuyu women had a lot of power in that society. And I was surprised that the way Hobley writes it is almost exactly the same way that Douglas Jardine writes about the position of the Somali women in that society. And you are going to see how so similar these descriptions are that you wonder it's like they were written by the same person about the same group of people. Now, this is what Hobley said before we read what Douglas Jardine says about a position of a Somali woman in the society of the Somali. He says, this is Hobley. Although far from negligible, the part played by women in the life of a savage tribe is very apt to be overlooked by a man. The reasons are obvious. The African woman is not obtrusive. She is perpetually busy, and one rarely comes into contact with her. Her inner thoughts and beliefs are a sealed book to the investigator, and one is at first inclined to believe that her influence is not worth consideration. The longer the experience, the more clearly one realizes that this lack of information about the woman is one of the weak points of any inquiry. So Hobley says it's a big mistake that you'll make when you come in. The first time you'll think the woman is silent. In fact, she's silent. She's not, as he says, obtrusive, which means she's silent. She's not all of us. You can't see her, and her thoughts are just with her. But then when you stay, you come to realize actually she has a lot of power, and that he goes on to describe how powerful women were in the Kikuyu Republic and how even men feared them. Now let's come to Douglas Jardine's book, The Mad Mullah of Somaliland, and let's see how he describes the place of a Somali woman in that society. He says, the Somali woman is generally of comely appearance, with good features and a light and elegant figure. Her prepossessing exterior, however, is entirely counteracted by a loud and querulous voice. Now, here it goes a little bit. It says she can be a little bit querulous. And one feels impelled to give the lie to Burton's judgment that one of the peculiar charms of the Somali girl is a soft, low, plaintive voice. Now, we've read Richard Burton's book. Is the book I just finished reading, where he describes, in fact, there is a place where he describes the Somali woman. I don't think I created a video about that. I do not think it was important, but you know what I think is important. This may not be what you think is important. That's why I always say, go find the book and read it for yourself. At first sight, now here is where it becomes so similar with how CW Hobley describes the Kikuyu woman, and see how Jardine describes the Somali woman, and see how similar they are. He says, at first sight, Eve seems to have a very unpleasant time in Somaliland. She is expected to do all the rough work, carry loads, hew woods, draw water, and tend the stock, while Adam engages in politics and war. Same thing to Agikuyu, where it says the Agikuyu woman was a very busy woman doing all this stuff. They say this is what CW says about the Agikuyu woman. This is what Jardine says about the Somali woman. He continued to say, this first impression is true enough up to a certain point, for the Somali is not a sentimental creature, and he has no more regard for a woman than he has for a camel. She is valuable asset necessary to the well-being of a tribe, and he extends to her the same marked consideration with which he treats his camel, and precisely similar reasons. Now, this is the impression you get, the first impression you get when you come into this society. Same case to what CW said. Now, it goes on, he said, in actual practice, now just like CW Hobley, he said, but, however, a clever, witty, and hard-working woman will rule the roost. Turns out, the woman, you will see the first impression that, oh, she's weak, she's helpless, she has no voice. Turns out she runs the house. And mere man will slink away time and again like a whipped car before the chidings of his womankind. So often the man will be beaten, not physically, like he will be overwhelmed by the women in his life that they will basically rule over him. He continues to say, the Somali women are devoted to their children, and the affection shown by both sexes of riper age for the small child is especially pleasing characteristic of the race. So the Somalis love their children, both men and women. They so much devoted to the well-being of their children. That's what he's saying. The Somali woman goes unveiled. This is 1920s. Things have changed a little bit. But otherwise, in her costume, she is modest itself. Like, she is very modest. And you know what modest is. She, respects herself. Her moral sense is high, judged by Oriental standard. Very high morals. And the Somali man attaches the highest importance to the chastity of his womankind. Very few Somalis can afford to maintain more than one wife. Now, I found this to be very interesting because the general understanding is that Somalis are generally polygamous people. But then turns out that it was a very small section of the male population that actually had more than one wife. And I think this is true. This fits so well to some other discussions I've seen about the concept of monogamy and polygamy, where it is said that very few men actually get to even have a wife throughout human history. Like, the majority of men don't get to get a wife. The majority of men throughout the entire human history. It is always said maybe it's about 40 or 50% of men who get to procreate throughout the human existence, but about 80% of women get to procreate. And that's because for a man to get the privilege of procreating, they have to do a lot of work. They have to show that they can provide and things like that. That's human nature. So it says in the Somali society, it wasn't so many men who had many wives. Most men had just one wife. It was just few men the rich guys, who could afford to have more than one wife. I found that to be very interesting. Those are my random thoughts.